So here we are, December the 6th, 2020. Someone asked just before we got started, how many Sundays left before we're done with 2020? Because 2020 has been canceled. And so there's, we get to have 4 Sundays this month, and it gets to be glorious, and it gets to be what we make it. And with that said, we're going to make today an amazing day through our consciousness, through our learning, through our being together for this hour. This month, in the month of December, we get to celebrate divine truth. So we're celebrating divine truth as we look at our finishing up our yearly theme of, Vision 2020. Week 1, we get to welcome the shadow, welcoming the shadow. And we have had already a great introduction to welcoming the shadow with our practitioner this morning and really diving into it. And so we're going to unpack that, unravel the gift. Yes, I said it, the gift that is our shadow. And in exploring the theme is, what do you learn from the shadow? What do you learn from the dark of the winter or the shadows cast in the heat of the summer? And what richnesses lives in the shadow places? I mean, those are all great questions in which to ponder, in which to be within our spiritual practice. And we have an opportunity today to really dive deep into this idea of the shadow places. So what does the shadow mean, or what is a shadow? So we're going to take like the physical and then the metaphysical, if you will. When we talk about a shadow is cast when there is an opaque object between the light and a surface. So you actually need light, you need an opaque surface, and you need something that is opaque and a surface, like a screen or the ground. So in the summertime, when the sun is shining and you look down onto the ground, you can see your shadow. Now, mind you, your shadow is 2D. It's 2-dimensional. You are 3-dimensional, and you are opaque. So it's solid enough to where the light does not pass through you, but in fact, it blocks it, and there's a shadow that is cast. Now, here's the thing that's important about a shadow. A shadow can give you, and it does give you, a lot of information about the object itself. So most of the time, you can tell what the object is by only looking at the shadow. So when you see a shadow of a dog or a tree, or sometimes when the light is shining through the blinds on your wall, you can see the lines that are cast, and you go, oh my gosh, look at that. Sometimes it's a great design, and it's like, wow, I hadn't noticed that, or I wish that was there all the time, because it just casts a shadow. The blinds or even your curtains sometimes will cast a pattern. If they're transparent, or they will cast some light. Now, here's the thing about that, is that as children, at least for me, when I was a kid, I was always intrigued by how some people could use their hands to cast a shadow that would look like a dog or a cat or a bird in flight. How many of you know what I'm talking about, right? Mention it in the chat if you choose to. So it's interesting because sometimes a shadow can give you information about the object itself, but sometimes the shadow could actually trick you and fool you into thinking that the object is something that it isn't. Like when we use our hands to cast a shadow that looks like a dog. It's not really a dog. It looks like a dog, but it's not a dog. So we get to have this lesson around shadow casting and around how shadows actually give us information, and how sometimes that information is misinformation or misleading about the object itself. Now, I like talking about Plato's allegory of the cave, because that famous story is about some people who were living in a cave. And I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it so we have an idea. There were people who were living in a cave. They were not able to get out. And there was a fire, to keep them warm, which had a light. And every time something passed between that flame and the light, it would cast a shadow on the cave wall, which is where the people were facing. Now, these folks who were living, these cave dwellers who were living there, they could only see the shadows that were cast upon the cave wall. And they began to believe that the shadow was the real thing. They thought that whatever, however large or small, that was the thing itself. Now, of course, later on, one of them was able to escape and actually come out of the cave. And actually, once coming out of the cave and seeing the sun and the light of the sun and having to adjust their eyes, they began to actually see the real thing, the object itself that cast the shadow on the cave wall. Now, it's interesting to note that the shadow itself is usually always black. But if you cast a green light, the shadow will be blue. If you cast a blue light, the shadow will be green. So the shadow is not always black. It depends on the light that you use, right? So now this person who has escaped this cave actually sees in full technicolor and sees all of the beautiful colors and shapes and actually sees the thing itself. Whereas before, this individual believed that the thing itself was the shadow because that is all that it had ever known. It was all that it was ever seeing and experiencing. But now that they are out of the cave, they're able to see life and to see the sun and to see all of creation in a different way. Sometimes we might say that this individual is enlightened. And so what do we get to learn about the shadow as a result of this allegory? And what do we get to learn about ourselves with this? And I tend to believe that we sometimes think that our shadow, as Carl Jung would say, those hidden parts of us that we don't want people to know about, those unpleasant ideas are also called our shadow or our shadow side. And we think to ourselves, you know what? I am not going to let anybody see my shadow. I don't want anyone to know these parts about me that I might consider ugly. And here's the beauty about that is, God is the light and the darkness. We have to break this idea that the darkness is bad. That is our race consciousness thinking, that the light is good and the darkness is bad. There's no such thing. The light and the dark are the same to God. God created it all. And so we actually get to look at this from a whole different perspective. And we get to recognize that the darkness or the shadow side of what we might call our shadow is actually there to bring us information. It brings us information about ourselves so that we might, in fact, unravel maybe these false ideas and false beliefs about who we think we are, so that we might actually get to know the truth of who we are. Now, in this allegory of the cave, that individual who left out decided, oh no, I can't let my, my beloveds, my community, I can't let them keep thinking that the shadow is actually the real thing itself. No, I have to actually go back and let them know that the real is actually out here, and that it has color, and that it shapes and dimensions and all kinds of things. It's actually three-dimensional. And so as this individual goes back into the cave and has to now adjust to the darkness and adjust, their eyes to be able to see and navigate back to where the community has been, they begin to tell the story about this three-dimensional realm and the sun and the colors. And of course, those folks who have been living in the cave and believing that the shadow is the real deal, almost want to do away with this one, and kill them, and, just kind of like, blasphemy, what are you saying? What are you saying? That it can't be true. This is the truth. This is the truth. And what we glean from that, one of the things that we're able to glean from that is that sometimes when we become enlightened, sometimes when we wake up to our divinity and we begin to share it with others, others are still stuck in race consciousness is the truth. And that our divine self, our true nature, that God living in, through, and as us cannot be the truth, that God has to be somewhere out there in the sky, far, far away, or whatever truth it is that we're simply trying to convey is now being disputed because so many folks continue to live in that cave consciousness. And wouldn't it be the same for us? That if one of our friends were to leave that cave consciousness and come back and say, hey, this is the real deal out here, not what we're living in, how would we be receptive and open to something like that? Or would we? And so this idea that the shadow is actually nothing to fear is kind of like that consciousness of leaving the cave. Because we have been taught so much to ignore the shadow, to hide the shadow, that the darkness and things that are dark are not good or not of God. And that is not the truth. The darkness and the light are the same to God. I mean, when I think about a seed going into the soil and it's dark, there's no light in that soil. Right? That in that darkness is where the growth happens. In that darkness, in that coldness is where this little seed is able to then reveal itself and crack open so that it can begin to grow and grow and grow and be its natural self and the fullness. So the darkness, the shadow is absolutely necessary. Now, what I can learn about myself and my quote unquote shadow is that everybody has one. And so this is an opportunity for us to challenge ourselves to be what we might call transparent. So here's the deal, right? In casting a shadow, you need light, you need an opaque object, and you need a screen or a surface. But as I now become a little more transparent, so in other words, as I now begin to actually say, oh, wait a minute, here's some of the things about my shadow, the things that I want to hide. Because, as the minister of the Downey Center for Spiritual Living, you like that voice? I have to have this level of honor and respect, and why I don't have a shadow. Not true. Right? Sometimes depending on where we are, whether we're the parent or the elder statesman, or whether, we are the wise one, the truth is that we all have a shadow side. And I know clearly that as minister, as practitioners, as community members in this kind of a forum, we actually consciously choose to grow publicly. You know, there's no such thing as like real privacy. We actually grow publicly. And so it is incumbent upon each of us to actually model for one another our shadow side, and to actually embrace the shadow as a mechanism and as a gift that brings us information about our true self. And sometimes it's misleading, because sometimes ego wants to tell us, nah, I don't have a shadow. Like, nah, there's nothing that I need to hide or that I don't want people to know. But yet, you know, one of the greatest lessons that I've learned about myself by being courageous enough and open enough and honest enough is that, you know, from some deep woundedness from childhood, I thought that I needed to be in control. You know, I was out of control as a kid. I didn't have a say so. Children should be seen and not heard. And there were things that were placed upon me that I accepted as a child, that I felt like I can't even control my own life. I can't even do certain things. And as a result of that trauma or that learning or that woundedness, I swore up and down that I would never, ever be out of control, that I would never let you see me sweat, that I would never let you see me down, that I would never, ever look like I didn't know anything or that I wasn't smart enough. And don't you know that everything in life was centered around trying to prove my worth and my worthiness, and that I had value and that I wasn't disposable. All because of that woundedness as a child, all because of some strange message that I received as a kid that was not the truth. And you see, that shadow was kind of like the hands and the dog. It was not really a dog. It was misleading. It was telling me that I wasn't enough, and so that I had to prove my worth and my value. And you might find that there are things for yourself that way, that there might be some old wounds, old harms that have you thinking that maybe you're not as good as or worthy enough. I tend to believe that these shadow spots, unless that they're looked at and unless they're examined courageously, are actually and can actually be used as tools of self-betrayal or as a weapon of mass distraction, distracting us from the truth of who we are. Because the truth of who we are, the truth of who you are, the truth of who I am, is that you are the unique and unrepeatable way that God shows up in human form. That you are beautiful and magnificent. That right where you are, that the love that God is, you are. That the peace, the joy, the abundance that God is, you are. That's the truth about me, and that's the truth about you. But unless we're willing to look and shine the light and be transparent so that the light could actually go through these misleading ideas, we will not grow. And if we're to create a world that works for everyone, then we have to use the spiritual tools that are laid at our feet to uncover and discover and discard those things that no longer serve us, those things that lie to us, like the fingers acting like a dog, looking like a shadow of a dog when it really isn't. Or like us believing that the shadow itself is the thing itself, when in reality, we are so much more. And so, beloveds, let's take a look at a couple of quotes as we wrap up this idea just for today and as we begin to do our work. Ernest Holmes says, you abide under the shadow of everlasting truth. Like that is the allness of who you are. You live and have your being under the shadow of everlasting truth. Now that's a different way to look at shadow, right? This shadow is everlasting truth, and that is where you abide. The other quote that I want to leave us with today is by Jacob Lieberman. He says, "What we call our shadow is nothing more than an aspect of our nature waiting to be embraced and reclaimed." So, in other words, at some point in time, we have abandoned our true nature. And it's time to reclaim that true nature. It is time to recognize that the shadow is actually a gift. And then finally, let's look at an affirmation that we can repeat to ourselves this week as we're working with embracing the shadow. I accept my whole self. As I embrace my shadow, I reclaim my highest good. I'm going to read that one more time. I accept my whole self. See yourself accepting your whole self, the yin and the yang, right? What is there and what is not. I accept my whole self. As I embrace my shadow, I reclaim my highest good. And so, beloveds, I'm encouraging you right now to see that the allness of who you are is beautiful, is magnificent, and it is the unique and unrepeatable way that God is showing up as you. Embrace yourself, embrace your whole self as you begin to reclaim the truth of who you are. Right where you are, God is. That power, that presence, that love, that joy, that abundance, that peace, that harmony, that health and wholeness, that divine wisdom that God is, you are. That, beloveds, is embracing your allness and your true self. It is so, and so we shall let it be, and so it is.